I read once that dreams shouldn't be taken seriously, that they are nothing but our unconscious mind interpreting random brain activity which happens naturally during sleep. But if all that noise and color and life is just coming from my brain, then how can two people share the same dream? I didn't recognize the other person in my dream, but I saw him in such vivid detail that it was hard to imagine him not being real. I'd guess he was about my age, in his late 20s, thick curly brown hair, with broad blue-tinged glasses perched upon a wide nose. His face was covered in rough black stubble, which progressed partway down his neck. I could see every individual hair on his head, the pores of his skin, and the slightest chip in one of his front teeth. I could see him in such detail because in my dream I was standing directly over him, while he lay in a shallow pool of water, just deep enough to cover his face. His eyes were wide open, and he was staring directly at me. I remember that he tried to speak to me, but the water around him filled his mouth, and I couldn't understand what he was trying to say. Logically, he should have just stood up if he wanted to talk to me, and logically, I should have helped him up if I wanted to listen to him. But it was a dream, so I just kept asking him to repeat himself, and he just kept on trying to talk, growing more and more frustrated the longer this went on. It wasn't until I was about to wake up that I realized my foot was on his chest, and that I had been holding him down the entire time. The dream dissipated within moments of waking, as it usually happens with me, and I didn't think anything more of it until around noon the next day. That's when I saw him, the same man from my dream, looking exactly as I had dreamt him, except his face was cleanly shaven this time. I was walking with my boss down the hallway of my office building when he strolled around the corner and passed us from the other direction. I guess I must have been staring a bit because he slowed down slightly as we passed by each other, and for a moment, we both stopped in the middle of the hallway and stared at each other. I couldn't think of any pretense to talk to him though. It's a rather large company and most of us don't know the other people who work in the other departments. Besides, my boss was with me and I didn't want to say anything weird or off-putting. So I just kept walking. I did look back for a second before I turned the corner though, just to see that he was still standing in the middle of the hallway, still staring at me over his shoulder. By the end of the day, I had decided that I was just overthinking things. We both worked at the same place, so I must have just seen him once before and then forgotten until he simply showed up in my dream. And it didn't have to be weird. I'd probably look back too if someone was staring at me like I had done to him. Fast forward to the next night, when I had the same exact dream. Only this time he was cleanly shaven, just like I had seen him last. He wasn't as calm this time either. He must have remembered that I was holding him down because he started thrashing in the water almost immediately. The water boiled and churned with the energy of his gargled shouting. I was afraid. I was afraid that if he got up, he would attack me. So I did the only thing I could think of, and that was to hold him down more. I held him down and I waited for what seemed like hours until his violent motions finally subsided. By the end of the dream, he wasn't trying to talk or move anymore. And when I woke up, I could still remember the sullen, angry glare upon his face. I was almost afraid to go into work the next day. It took an extra long shower that morning just to help me convince myself that I was being stupid. I usually have a pretty precisely timed morning routine, so that shower was enough to ensure I was late for work. My boss is usually quite chill, and my tardiness wouldn't have been that big an issue if it weren't for the guy waiting for me. I didn't see him until he rapped on my driver's side window with his knuckle shortly after I parked. We stared at each other through the window, which felt chillingly reminiscent of the thin layer of water which divided us in my dream. The same sullen glare. The same instinct that he was going to attack me the moment we stood on equal footing. But of course, this was the real world, and I had already spent the whole morning convincing myself how stupid this whole situation was. So I took a deep breath and I rolled the window down. "Yes?" I asked him, trying to play cool. "Do I know you? Why didn't you let me get up?" He asked me without the slightest pretense. "I was drowning, and you knew I wanted to get out of there. So why were you holding me down?" I couldn't decide whether to acknowledge that I knew what he was talking about or not. I wanted to tell him that it was just a dream, that I was scared, worried, that it was somehow his fault for being underwater in the first place. I must have panicked though, because the only thing that came out of my mouth was, "I don't know what the hell you're talking about." I tried to open my car door to get out, but the second it started to open, he slammed it shut again. His face was becoming bright and flushed. He looked equally capable of screaming at me or bursting into tears at any moment. "How does it feel, huh? Being trapped?" he shouted at me. I tried opening the door again, but it was my arm against his entire body weight leaning against my car, and though I struggled, I couldn't budge him. "I was drowning. I don't care why you were doing it. I just want to hear you say it. I want you to admit that you were doing it to me." "You're insane," I shouted back at him. "Get away from my car." I started to roll up my window. I wouldn't have to admit it if I could just wait him out. Sooner or later, someone else would come through the parking lot and they'd help me. They'd call security and he'd be dragged away. Or fired. I didn't care what happened to him, to be honest. Just so long as I didn't have to admit that I knew what he was talking about. His arm lashed out to block the rapidly closing window and he snatched at me. I just kept closing the window until it caught his arm, preventing him from getting at me. I figured he'd retreat at the last second, but he didn't. His arm was pinned by the rising glass and his face kept growing redder and redder. He started yelling and cursing, and then I began yelling back, demanding he pull his arm out of there even though I knew it must have been pinned. He wanted me to open the window again, but I didn't because I knew he'd grab me the second he had space to move. I was freaking out, and the only thing I could think to do was to keep holding the button down, putting more and more pressure on his arm until, all at once, the window shattered. 1,000 cracks and fractures appearing from nowhere. He screamed and ripped his arm away, and the whole entire window bent and wrenched free with him. A second later, we were staring at each other through the now opened window. Him red-faced and snarling, and me terrified out of my mind. I quickly put my car into reverse and lurched out of the parking spot, not looking back until I was out onto the street. He wasn't chasing after me or anything. Thank God. But I could still see him in the rearview mirror. I left him and my broken window in that parking lot and drove straight home. When I arrived, I called my boss to tell him that I wouldn't be coming in that day. I've been pacing around my room ever since I got home, unsure how I can ever go back to work and face him again. I'm seriously considering quitting my job, but I don't think that will even help. Because, whatever I do, I can't erase the last thing he shouted after me as I pulled out of the parking lot. "I'll be seeing you tonight."